The American border closes tonight. Not forever. Not a war. A tariff escalation. A diplomatic standoff. A 72-hour shutdown while lawyers in Washington and Ottawa argue about dairy quotas. How long until the grocery store shelves in Toronto go empty? 3 days. Not 3 weeks. Not 3 months. 3 days. Canada runs a just-in-time food system. The grocery stores do not have warehouses. They have trucks. And those trucks cross the border every morning carrying 90% of Canada's leafy greens, 75% of its fresh fruit, and most of the processed food that fills the center aisles. If the trucks stop, the lettuce goes first, then the tomatoes, then the berries, the peppers, the spinach. Within 72 hours, the produce section is bare. The center aisles last a few days longer, canned goods, pasta, cereal. But even those are largely processed in American plants from Canadian raw materials, shipped back across the same border that just closed. This is not a hypothetical. In February 2025, when tariff threats peaked, Canadian importers panic ordered. Processed food imports hit the highest level in recorded history. They knew what was coming. The system has no buffer. This sounds insane, because Canada is a food superpower, second largest country on Earth, more arable land than most continents, fifth largest food exporter in the world. We grow enough calories to feed 200 million people, 5 times our population. And we import 30% of our food. We pay some of the highest grocery prices in the developed world. 2.2 million Canadians visit food banks every month. 1/4 of all Canadian households are food insecure. We are a country that feeds the planet and cannot feed itself. We export the raw ingredients for pennies. We import the finished meals for dollars. We have built a food system designed to export value and import inflation. Today, we are going to perform a forensic audit on the Canadian dinner plate. 1. The Calorie Colony. Start with the balance sheet. Canada exports 75% of its wheat, 90% of its canola, 70% of its pork, 50% of its beef, 95% of its pulses, 65% of its soybeans. In raw calories, Canada is a fortress. Seal the borders and nobody starves. There's enough grain and meat to feed every Canadian indefinitely. So why is food insecurity at record highs? Because Canadians do not eat wheat. They eat bread. They do not eat canola seed. They eat cooking oil. They do not eat live pigs. They eat bacon. And Canada has stopped making those things. This is the number that tells the story. At the turn of the century, Canadian-produced food accounted for 80% of total domestic consumption. By 2015, that number had fallen to 70%. It is still falling. Over the last 30 years, we have systematically dismantled our food processing capacity. The Heinz ketchup plant in Leamington closed. The Kellogg's cereal lines gone. Canning factories across southern Ontario shuttered. Parsnip and turnip production has fallen 35%. Peach and carrot production down 18%. Corn production down 16%. The processing jobs that turned raw commodities into the food people actually eat have been relocated to the United States. Here is how the system works. A farmer in Saskatchewan grows wheat. That wheat is loaded onto a train and shipped to a mill in Minnesota. The mill grinds it into flour, packages it, brands it, and ships it back to a grocery store in Saskatoon. The farmer gets the commodity price. The American processor gets the value-added margin. The Canadian consumer pays for the shipping south, the American labor, the American profit, and the shipping north. We are paying a processing premium on our own resources. This is the definition of a colony economy. We provide the raw materials. The empire provides the finished goods. The empire keeps the profit. If that sounds familiar, it should. We covered this exact architecture in our Ontario video. The branch plant model. The same structure that has defined Canadian manufacturing for 120 years, applied to the food on your table. Canada does not have a food production problem. Canada has a food processing problem. We grow the ingredients and let someone else cook. 2. The wall inside. Now here is where it gets structural. A farmer in Alberta wants to sell beef to a grocery store in Ontario. Not to Tokyo, not to Seoul, to Toronto. This is harder than exporting to Japan. Canada has interprovincial trade barriers, regulations, standards, and inspection requirements that make it extraordinarily difficult to move food across provincial lines. In November 2025, all 13 provinces and territories signed a landmark agreement to drop trade barriers on goods moving within Canada. The deal was celebrated as a breakthrough, the first real step toward one Canadian economy. They carved out a massive exception, food and alcohol. It is easier to ship a case of British Columbia wine to Paris than to sell it in Ontario. It is easier to send Alberta beef to a slaughterhouse in Colorado than to a processor in Quebec. The IMF estimates that these internal barriers act like a 6.9% tariff on goods moving within Canada. That is higher than the average tariff the United States currently imposes on Canadian exports. We are taxing ourselves. This is not an exaggeration. Different provinces have different meat inspection regimes, different labeling rules, different packaging standards. A small beef producer in Alberta needs a federal license to sell across provincial lines, the same license required to export internationally. A jam maker in Nova Scotia faces different certification requirements in every province. The cost of compliance makes it cheaper to sell abroad than to sell domestically. One economist told CBC, the real barriers are not regulations. They are distance and transportation costs. He is half right. The regulations made the distance permanent. Because it was always easier to ship south than east, the infrastructure was built that way. The rail lines run north-south. The trucking routes run north-south. The contracts are written north-south. So when the border tightens, tariffs, inspections, diplomatic disputes, Canada cannot just switch to domestic supply. The east-west infrastructure does not exist. The processing capacity does not exist. The legal framework does not exist. We have partitioned our own country into 13 separate food economies. None of them are large enough to be self-sufficient. All of them are integrated vertically with the United States instead of horizontally with each other. Let me know in the comments. Did you know it is harder to sell food across a provincial border than across the international border? Tell me if this surprises you. 3. The compounding factors. 2 more layers squeeze Canadian food prices from above. The first is supply management. For dairy, poultry, and eggs, Canada does not operate a free market. The government sets production quotas, fixes prices, and imposes tariffs up to 300% on foreign imports. The system was designed to protect farmers. It works. Canadian dairy farmers are among the most financially stable in the world. The cost is paid at the checkout. Milk, cheese, butter, chicken, and eggs are significantly more expensive in Canada than in the United States, Europe, or Australia. A block of cheese that costs $4 in Michigan costs $8 in Ontario. This is a regressive tax. It hits low-income families hardest. The second is grocery concentration. 5 companies control 80% of the Canadian grocery market. Loblaws, Sobeys, Metro, Walmart, and Costco. The traditional supermarket space is dominated by 3 of them. This is an oligopoly. When inflation hit in 2022, 2023, these companies did not just pass on costs. They expanded their margins. They posted record profits while Canadians were skipping meals. Their real power is gatekeeping. They control the shelf space. Small Canadian food producers pay listing fees and supply chain fines to access it. Many cannot afford the toll. They die, or they sell out to larger firms. Local resilience shrinks. Corporate supply chains, optimized for profit, not security, expand. Supply management restricts what Canadians produce. The grocery oligopoly controls what Canadians buy. Together, they form a bottleneck that inflates prices at every stage between the farm and the fork. What do you think? Is supply management protecting Canadian farmers, or is it a hidden tax on Canadian families? Drop your answer in the comments. 4. The tariff trigger. Everything we have described, the processing gap, the internal walls, the supply bottleneck, was manageable when the border was open and the dollar was strong. Neither condition is guaranteed. 2 weeks ago, the Bank of Canada released research confirming that 87% of food price inflation in 2025 was caused by import costs, not domestic factors. Imports. Canadian food prices are not set in Ottawa. They are set in California and Chicago. Since 2020, food prices in Canada have risen 27%. That is not a blip. That is a structural repricing of the Canadian diet. The tariff war with the United States, ongoing since early 2025, has added direct costs to every imported vegetable, fruit, and processed product. Canada responded to American tariffs with counter-tariffs, then removed most of them in September, then saw the damage was already embedded in supply chain contracts that will not reset for years. The Buy Canadian movement gained real momentum. 76% of Canadians reported actively avoiding American products. Retailers labeled Canadian goods with maple leaves and flags, but the math does not support the sentiment. Canada imports 75% of its fresh vegetables and 50% of its fruit. In British Columbia, 81% of spinach, 70% of lettuce, and 75% of onions come from the United States. 97% of avocados come from Mexico. There is no domestic alternative for most of this. The growing season is too short. The greenhouse capacity is too small. You cannot boycott food, you cannot replace. And the food we do produce, we export it. 52% of Canadian fruit and vegetable production is shipped abroad. Even though we are massive net importers of the same products, we are the 5th largest food exporter in the world and the 6th largest food importer. We export the raw surplus and import the finished deficit, both at the same time. The food system is not just economically exposed, it is structurally exposed. A weaker Canadian dollar, which we explored in our Broken Barrel and Dollar Milkshake videos, makes every imported food item more expensive in direct proportion to the decline. If the dollar falls from 70 cents to 60 cents, the price of every imported vegetable rises by 15% overnight. We have exposed our biological survival to the currency markets. 5. The kitchen table. Bring this to the household. According to the 2026 Canada Food Price Report, a family of 4 will spend $17,572 on food this year. That is an increase of nearly $1,000 from last year. That is $1,464 a month, just to eat. For a family earning median income, food now approaches 20% of take-home pay. Combine that with the housing trap, 50% of income, and the transport trap, 15%, and there is nothing left. The arithmetic of Canadian middle-class life does not add up. Alberta, New Brunswick, Nova Scotia, Ontario, and Quebec will all see food price increases above the national average this year. The provinces with the highest housing costs are the same provinces being hit hardest by food inflation. The squeeze is not random. It is concentrated exactly where people are already breaking. Food banks are no longer for the unemployed. Nurses are in line. Construction workers, engineering students. 2.2 million Canadians visit food banks every single month. 86% of Canadians report eating less meat because of cost. But only 17% have increased plant-based protein. They are not switching. They are shrinking. Eating less, eating worse. 25% are buying more frozen food, not by preference, by necessity. The wealthy eat fresh. The poor eat whatever is calorie-dense and cheap. This is nutritional inequality in a country that grows enough food to feed 5 times its population. This is the verdict on the resource superpower. We have the land, we have the water, we have the crops. And our people are hungry. Quick poll in the comments. What percentage of your take-home pay goes to food? I want to see the real numbers. 6. The verdict. Food sovereignty. Here's the distinction that matters. Canada has food security. On paper. We have enough money to buy food from the global market. As long as the dollar holds, the border stays open, and the trucks keep running, nobody starves. Canada does not have food sovereignty. We do not control the means of feeding ourselves. We rely on a just-in-time trucking system that crosses a border controlled by a protectionist government. We rely on a currency pegged to the price of oil. We rely on an oligopoly that prioritizes share buybacks over affordable calories. We rely on interprovincial trade rules that treat food as an exception to national unity. The system is efficient. It is also fragile. A resilient country would process its own wheat into its own bread. It would tear down the internal walls between its own provinces. It would break the grocery bottleneck. It would invest in greenhouses, cold storage, and regional processing, not just export terminals. We have done none of this. The interprovincial trade agreement signed in November 2025, the one celebrated as a breakthrough, excluded food entirely. The one product every Canadian needs every single day was carved out of the deal. Here at Hoch, we look at the structural flaws. And the flaw in the Canadian food system is the same flaw we found in Ontario's factories, in the CUSMA renegotiation, in the branch plant model that has defined this country for 120 years. We built a system to serve someone else's market and forgot to serve our own people. The shelf is not empty yet, but the price tag is rising. And for millions of Canadians, an unaffordable shelf is the same thing as an empty one. If this hit home, drop a like so more Canadians see it. Subscribe for economic truths nobody else will say out loud. And tell me in the comments, do you think Canada will ever build a food system that prioritizes feeding Canadians over exporting commodities? Or is the colony model the only model this country will ever know? I am Hoch, and I will see you in the next one.